Welcome back to Monday Mod Tips. Today we're going to be covering disassembling the internals from a blaster, how to take them out and what to do with them so that you don't lose parts and don't break things and all of that, and so that you know how to put it back together when you're done. I highly recommend when you open up the shell to do it very slowly so that you don't accidentally spring any springs and they don't go flying all over the place. I also highly recommend taking a picture of what the internals looked like when it was together so that you can reference that when you go to put it back together. Also, take a minute and actually look at where everything is and look at how all the parts interact. So you can tell, okay, this is obviously the rev, and there's a lock that prevents you from pulling the trigger if you don't have the rev switch pulled. Okay, you may or may not want that when you're done. That's up to you. This is all part of the mag release assembly. When you pull this, when you push this, it pulls that, which pulls this, which pulls that, which releases the magazine. This switch is only engaged when there is a magazine in the blaster. Obviously, so that's a mag lock. You may or may not want that. I will be taking it out for this particular blaster. I will also be replacing all of the switches with more powerful switches, and it'll be rewired for LiPo. But taking things out, internal screws are almost always silver as compared to external screws, which are black, so that helps you keep them apart. But once again, there tends to be lots of different sizes, so you may want to keep track of that when you put it back together. It's slightly less important on the inside because the variance tends to be less and also slightly less important. But do make a note of where the washer head screws are, because those are important, and they're generally will be on moving parts, though not always, but generally you'll have a washer head screw on any part that moves. So that should give you a clue towards that. So we're taking everything out because we're doing a complete rewire. Rev trigger, rev lock. Note that the springs are fairly specific. You generally don't find springs that can be used in multiple places. Sometimes you do, but not very often. So far, all the washer head screws have been identical, so it doesn't matter which ones go where. And we've only had one non-washer head screw so far. Now this is another one of those places you want to be careful when you take things out so that you don't lose springs, because they are usually slightly pre-compressed. A lot of these springs actually do look... No, they're all slightly different, it looks like. Slightly different lengths. It probably wouldn't matter too much, but if you put it back together and things are being a little hinky, you may have gotten your springs in the wrong locations. Whenever possible, put the screw back in where it came from. So in the case of this, since this is a two-part piece, I have put the screw back in to hold it together so I know which screw it was and where it goes. You can also actually do that inside the blaster if you really want. You can put all of the washer head screws back on when you go to do the paint job, because the inside probably isn't going to be getting painted and it won't really matter. But that is entirely up to you. There does occasionally get spray when you're painting inside the blaster. So I remove pretty much everything just in case, because if you get paint specks on moving parts, they will often not move right anymore. They'll be a little bit sticky, and that can be a problem. So the big rails just come off. They are actually, turns out this one's two parts and they're all screwed together, but you don't have to take those screws out, which is nice. Alright. Now these are the ones that are quite possibly a different size because they are part of the, so they're much longer because they are the ones holding the flywheel cage in place. But they're likely to be the only ones in here that are that long. Nope. Looks like the ones that are holding the pusher mechanism are that long as well. Okay, so all of the screws that were holding the main firing mechanism in place were the same size. So that makes that easy. The only other screw that was a different size isn't even going to be putting back in because it held the trigger lock in place, and we're not putting that trigger lock back in. Barrel comes out. Hop-up comes out. Now, here's another thing you want to be careful of when you start to remove things. Again, do it slowly because we've discovered there is another switch that is screwed in underneath, and if you just pulled it out, you might have flung stuff around the room or you might have broken something. This is the jam door lock, which will also likely not be going back in place. Though if it does, it will be in a different capacity. We may have the jam door switch turn on the voltmeter. This is a very popular thing. Rather than having it on the rev trigger, you can put it on the voltmeter or jam door, so you can open the jam door to see what your voltage is. I believe Jomo prefers to have them on rev, which is perfectly fine. The amount of force that you use when removing parts can vary depending on whether or not that part's going back in. So these battery leads, I'm actually not going to be putting them back in because I will be rewiring it for an XT60. And so I could just yank these out. But if you are planning to reuse them, you can pry them out without breaking them. This switch is not attached. This one looks like it's glued in. But again, it's not going back in because these stock switches can't handle the voltage and amperage that are going to be going through this thing. This to the last bit, which is also glued, but not solvent welded or super glued. It's kind of almost looks like hot glue, but not quite. There we go. So I had to find an angle where I could get leverage on it. There we go. Okay. There are the internals, and I highly recommend having a bag for all of your internals. Now, like I said, we're going to be doing a complete rewire, so all of the switches and all of the wires are going, all of the little circuit boards on all of the motors are going, all of the switches, all of that. But for now, we will just put it in a bag, keep it separate. Same with all of these parts, they should go in the bag if you're not going to be working on them immediately, which I am, so I'm going to leave them in the magnet bowl. Now we can take a look in here and see what else we want to remove. So we are going to remove this, which is what is holding the jam door in place. And this piece does not need to get painted because it won't be seen. But this will be getting painted. Now going to the other side, there is of course the safety and the other side of the mag release, which is ambidextrous, which I greatly appreciate, being left-handed and all. Alright, so that is the basics on removing internals. Have bags, keep them, label them if you want. Generally, you can tell which ones came from what. Same with the springs and the screws and all of the other internal parts. Keep them somewhere safe where you're not going to bump it or a cat's going to knock it off or you're just going to forget about it or lose it. Keep it all together and you should then be able to reassemble when the time comes. Next, we will of course cover putting the parts back in and then reassembly. So let me know what other topics you'd like to see in future videos down in the comment section. And as always, thank you for watching.